My name is Injuna. I'm an instructor at the Writing Center. And so today I want to talk about a little bit about what happens when bilingual writers in our situation, right? Our bilingual writers write in English. And the first thing that I want to preface this with is that I had some help in developing this webinar. The thing that I want to, I think, emphasize is we already have an excellent webinar on contrastive analysis between Russian and English that my colleague Aris Menzies did last year, I think, and it's up on the website. So I didn't necessarily, I wanted to do something a little bit different. So it's kind of like not to just repeat what we already have, especially in terms of adding Kazakh into it, right? Because our students are not just Russian speakers, but they're also Kazakh speakers. But myself, not being an extremely fluent speaker of Kazakh, I needed some help. So I reached out to my very dear friend, Laura Berdikhozhaeva. She's a comparative literature PhD candidate at Leiden University, and she is a native Kazakh speaker and a writer. She writes in Kazakh as well. So she had a big hand in helping me out with a lot of things in this webinar. So I wanted to acknowledge her as well as my students. They're listed below: Жанна Muratbekqızı, Miras Samatova, and Jibek Rahmbekqızı, who graciously gave me permission to analyze their writing. They're also primary Kazakh speakers. So that's what I wanted to say right off the bat. And also, as I just mentioned, I'm very sick, so I'm sorry. I'm running a fever, so I might not be making sense at some point. So Aidana, if you ever feel like, oh, she's losing it, feel free to interrupt and ask me a question. And I'm sorry if I need to blow my nose a little bit. I'll try to keep it to a minimum. Okay, so with that said, kind of like a little bit of an introduction, right, of like why talk about this. So of course, as we all know, we here at NU, we have an English medium university where we've got largely a bilingual student populace, right? And for many of our students, English is not even their second language, right? It's their third language. So that's why I say Kazakh primary speakers rather than simply Kazakh native speakers, because we've got a lot of students who are fluent in both languages. So when I reached out for my students, sort of like with this question, would anybody be interested in helping me out and giving me permission to look at their writing, I specifically asked for people who felt that Kazakh was their primary language, not simply that they were fluent in it, but that they felt like this was their native, most comfortable language, the language they kind of thought in, right? So that's why I'm not sure if that's like the correct linguistic term, but that's why I'm saying Kazakh primary speakers rather than simply native speakers. And so, of course, what we see, right, in an English medium university with non-native speaker students is that, of course, they struggle with a lot of things such as grammar, mechanics, word usage, and stylistic conventions when they write in English. And what I've been noticing is kind of like the type of feedback, right? Is ever since I came to work at the Writing Center back in 2017, I think, right? I've been thinking about this, and I've seen that students get this feedback from English speaking faculty, right? Like, oh, this sounds awkward. This doesn't sound English. You should fix your language, and not just students. In the Writing Center, I worked with some faculty members who were actually, for example, trying to publish their research, but their drafts were being rejected from journals on kind of like on along the same lines, right? Asking them to fix style, fix language, and from my experience, this leads to kind of these worries and concerns on the part of the students about kind of that their writing is clunky, or they don't know that they can even fix it, and kind of that's what is driving, right, my desire to look into this. And so one thing that we can look at, right, when we talk about this, is contrastive analysis. So contrastive analysis is a branch of linguistics that compares various features of two languages and seeks to identify similarities and differences, and then apply that knowledge in various fields. Now, again, one more disclaimer: I'm not a linguist by education or training, so take what I say with a grain of salt. I did fall down a research rabbit hole as I was preparing for this. So if anybody, oh, hello, Karina, welcome. So if people are interested in further reading, I've got a collection of lovely PDFs on my folder now. But contrastive analysis, right? Historically, what has it been used for is to identify language genealogies. So this is when scholars would look and compare various features of languages and actually identify, like, oh, this looks similar, right? This languages might actually have a common ancestor, right? And that's where the concept of language families came from. But more recently, contrastive analysis has been used to analyze this process of second language acquisition and kind of ask a question of to what extent and in what ways does your native language affect the process of learning a second language? And can we predict common issues? Can we predict how a speaker of a certain language will struggle with, for example, when they're learning English, in hopes of maybe changing and altering our teaching, our instruction, when we help these individuals learn to communicate and write in the second language. So some of this kind of like notable things, right, that we might emphasize when we're doing contrastive analysis of the three languages that are of the immediate concern to us. English and Russian are, of course, both in the Indo-European language family, whereas Kazakh is part of the Turkic language family. English is an analytical language, analytical not in the lay person's term meaning, although that is said sometimes as well, but in the sense of, in the linguistic sense, that it uses particles and prepositions to show relationships between words in a sentence, right? Whereas Kazakh and Russian are both synthetic languages, which means that they add morphemes to the root word, but they do it in a slightly different ways, right? Kazakh is agglutinative, which means it adds two or more. Aidana and Karina, of course, familiar with this, right? There are some jokes about how you can have almost, these ridiculously long words in Kazakh because you can keep adding morphemes to add new meanings. Whereas in Russian, you cannot do that, right? It's usually just maybe one. And Russian also uses prepositions. So again, if you are very interested in comparing these things, I do want to also once again emphasize our releases webinar that's on the Writing Center website. I'm doing something slightly different because I wanted to bring in Kazakh to this. Another concept that we kind of want to look at is language transfer, which is simply transference of linguistic features of one language when communicated in another language. All of us here do this if you speak more than one language. And we sort of distinguish negative transfer, which is when you transfer items and structures that are not the same in both languages, and thus you commit an error. And positive transfer, when you transfer items and structures that are similar enough that it actually results in intelligible and acceptable communication, acceptable by native speakers, right? So you say something thinking of your native language, but it actually sounds okay in the second language as well. So we'll now look at some examples of how it works when Kazakh and Russian speakers try to communicate in English. So let's start with like a very kind of simple examples as a warm-up. gender in language, right? So in comparing these three languages, we know that Russian uses gendered pronouns and has grammatical gender. So for example, let's look at this sentence. Кэрол Дуэк, американский психолог, она разработала идею мышления на рост. Если ты веришь, что можешь улучшить свои способности, то у тебя получится. Here in purple you can see, right, there's a gender pronoun, она, as well as the verb itself changes to reflect the gender because the character of the sentence is a woman. In English, we do still have gendered pronouns, but we lose the grammatical gender. So the same sentence in English is Carol Dweck is an American psychologist. She coined the term growth mindset, the idea that if you believe you can improve your talents, you will. So we retain she to indicate gender of Carol Dweck, but the verb coined is no longer gendered, right? It would be the same if we were talking about a man. And then Kazakh has just one gender neutral pronoun and also no grammatical gender. So if we translate the sentence to Kazakh, Carol Dweck, американдық психолог, ол егер адам өздерінің дамыта алам деп сенсе, ол ойларына жетеді деген ойды білдіретін, дамуға ұмтылатын ойлау үлгісі ұғымын ойлап тапты, right? So all is used for Carol Dweck, and it would be used for a man as well, and for inanimate objects. And then the verb itself is also unchanged. So we've got this difference in terms of comparing how gender is reflected in language. So what does that mean for transference? So in my experience, Russian-speaking students might have it easier in terms of using gendered pronouns in English, except for using he or she to refer to inanimate objects or abstract concepts, because in Russian, you would still use gendered pronouns for inanimate things and for concepts. So sometimes kind of that slips into English writing, or like the student would be writing about something like democracy, right? And call it she, because it's female grammatically in Russian. But I find that this is pretty rare in university level students. This seems to be more of a common mistake in, around kind of high school level, or at least for speakers, for learners kind of at the beginning of their learning journey. Now, for Kazakh speaking students, they tend to mix up he and she when referring to individuals in their writing. So the lack of gendered pronouns in their native language transfers into this kind of sometimes confusion in English. So this is relatively common in my experience. I think sometimes when I see a paper where the student is referring to a researcher and just keeps alternating between he and she, I'm thinking, oh, this must be a Kazakh speaker. And quite often I'm right if I ask about this later on. So this can be kind of like a giveaway. All right, any questions or thoughts so far? I see that we've got a third person joining us.
So you I actually have this kind of mistakes when I'm speaking because when I'm writing, I have much more time to check it. But when I'm speaking and when I'm doing it fast, I can sometimes mix all of these pronouns and say democracy as she, and yeah, that's my bad.
Yeah, for sure. I think that the difference between writing and speaking is like a whole other rabbit hole to research, right? How because cognition works differently in those two contexts. Okay, so that's gender. So now let's look at prepositions. So this is a sentence. So let's read it and tell me if you notice anything that's off. Linguists compare features of different languages to understand how they affect on language acquisition of non-native speakers.
Actually,
go ahead, Karina.
Okay, it seems to be not confusing, but I don't think that is right. How they affect on language. I don't know why it seems not. It doesn't sit right with me. Okay, that's it.
Okay. So you feel in your gut, right? Aidana?
So there should be no preposition. So if we like translate it from Russian, there should be preposition. So we assume like влияние на язык. So that's why maybe the person confused.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Thank you both. So in Russian, if you say this, лингвисты сравнивают характеристики разных языков, чтобы понять, как они влияют на усвоение языка неносителями. Because in Russian, there would be a preposition. It's a very, very common negative transfer that I see in writing. And I saw Lori also nodding her head that because both Russian and Kazakh has prepositions, right? Sometimes Russian and English has prepositions. Sometimes Russian-speaking students will kind of fall back on their knowledge of what kind of preposition is supposed to be here in Russian, and then they use it in English. Now, what about Kazakh, right? So Kazakh is, again, a synthetic agglutinative language, meaning there are no prepositions. So before I show you kind of the same sentence written by a Kazakh speaker, what are your expectations in terms of how would absence of preposition in Kazakh affect English writing?
Maybe positively, yes, because if there is no prepositions, then we would expect that when you are translating it in your head, then you wouldn't have a preposition in English version either. So that is why it's maybe positive for me.
That's amazing. You got something that took years for linguists to figure out. But initially, the hypothesis in contrastive analysis were that the further languages are away from each other, the worse the native language would affect second language acquisition, right? Because it was assumed that if the languages were very, very different, then the person who's learning the language would struggle more. But if we look at the same sentence written by a Kazakh speaker, there is no mistake here in the language acquisition, in the part affects language acquisition. So, and here for context is a Kazakh version of the same sentence. And of course, it wouldn't have a preposition because instead it's using morphemes in the word itself, right, to reflect the same relationship between ideas. And so in analyzing the samples, right, of writing assignments of my Kazakh speaking students, I actually noticed this, right? Now, again, trying to be an honest researcher, my sample was extremely small, right? So, but this is just something interesting that I noticed, right, that there were fewer mistakes in terms of prepositions. And so I was going to create a mystery here, but Karina already gave it away. I was going to say, oh, before I offer the explanation, let's look at another example, but it's kind of, it's already there. But I'll show you one more example of this. So let's look at sentence structure now, right? So when we look at the three languages, how do they compare? So English has a pretty rigid sentence structure in terms of word order, right? Subject, verb, object. I'm writing an essay. I was supposed to be blue. I don't know why it turned red. And then Kazakh is a verb final language. So subject, object, verb is pretty common, but the most important thing is that the verb has to always be at the end of the sentence. So you would say, men esse жазып жатырмын, right? So the object is now in the middle, verb is at the end. And Russian, of course, as you know, is flexible, right? You can say it however you want. It still makes sense. Mix subject, verb, and object however you like. So what does it mean for transfer? The other thing, that I will also want to point to is what constitutes a complete sentence in each language. So in English, it's again a pretty rigid that you have to have a subject and a verb in order for the sentence to count as complete and not kind of be a sentence fragment. And also one thing that we often say about in terms of English writing and clarity in English writing is that we kind of want to convey characters performing actions, right? And so like when the verb in the sentence expresses a strong action and the subject aligns with the character who is responsible for that action, that is usually how you achieve clarity in English, right? So English is very oriented towards strong subject-verb pairs and needs a subject and a verb for it to be a complete sentence. In Kazakh, it's pretty similar. You also need to have subject and verb, but subject can be omitted or implied. So in the previous example, right, men esse жазып жатырмын, you could kind of drop men, right? You could say esse жазып жатырмын. And the reason you could drop the I, the subject, is because in the verb, it's already implied that you're talking about yourself, right? The morpheme mun means that I'm talking about me, right? And so it's kind of, you can drop the subject easier because the subject will still be implied in your verb. And then in Russian, a sentence can be complete without a subject or without a verb, and sometimes kind of without both, right? Russian is kind of amorphous like that, right? So for Russian students, this often results in, because they're used to this kind of sort of very flexible sentence structures, what it means for their English writing is that they transfer passive constructions, which make sense in Russian, but in English might make their writing convoluted and or confusing. So let's look at an example. In these is seen a lack of confidence in how to solve the problem of intelligence measurement. So tell me your thoughts about this sentence.
There is a passive construction. In this is seen a lack of confidence, and that's actually my big problem, because I really use a lot of passive voices in English writing, and sometimes professors and instructors will be like, why do you use this passive voice? Why do you use this that much? This is not okay. But this is really because of my Russian thinking, I guess, because I still think in Russian, and then I translate it in my mind, and I think it's look prettier, it's look more, I don't know, literature literature when you're doing this in passive voice, but it's not actually that pretty often use it in English as I got it.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks. I feel like yours is a pretty common experience. Anybody else want to weigh in? Okay, so yeah, I want to show sort of how this would look in Russian, right? I think all of us can see that the English version kind of feels clunky, right? But if we translate this as kind of like how the writer was probably thinking of this in terms of Russian, в этом проглядывается отсутствие уверенности в том, как решить проблему измерения интеллекта. In Russian, it doesn't sound as awkward, right? It's much more natural to express yourself in this way because the Russian allows for this type of flexible structure. And also, for example, if we look at the English sentence, right, the word order is wrong. Verb comes before subject, and that makes it awkward in English, but in Russian, right, it's acceptable. Now let's try to Englishize, I don't know if that's a term, this sentence. How would you fix this? Who is the character performing an action in this sentence?
Do you mean in the middle sentence?
I mean, in these is seen a lack of confidence in this one, like if we were try to improve it.
A lack of confidence is seen.
Okay, yeah, great. We could we could reverse it at least, right, to conform to English, a word order. Who sees the lack of confidence?
It's like it's like no one, but in Russian language it's like it is obvious, for everyone. Like it is seen that the lack of confidence in house is all the form of in Russian it's like it's obvious for everyone, but in English version it's like no one. But we can say like one can observe that the lack of confidence in how to solve the problem. I don't know, maybe we can add one or something like this.
Yeah, maybe everyone, right? Maybe I am seeing, right, the lack of confidence. It's unclear. And who lacks confidence?
Yeah, it's also not obvious from the English version because there is like no one. It's like, yeah, it seems to be awkward sentence because it doesn't give that much information as Russian version.
Yeah, it's interesting that you perceive it that way, because there's the same, I feel like there's the same amount of information, right? But in Russian, it feels more acceptable than in English. But I think this kind of shows a very common issue, right? That I see in my students, in that because they're transferring passive constructions, they forget often to specify who or what they're actually talking about, right? Which results in unclear or vague writing, right? So when you get feedback from your professor, oh, this is vague, unclear, who are you talking about? This might often be where it's coming from.
Could I just ask Injuna then, before you change the slide, is more assumed then? So when Russian speakers are speaking Russian, is it more contextual? So less is said, more is assumed? Whereas in English, you have to like basically say everything has to be clearly spoken and you can't assume as much. That's interesting that more is assumed then, less is said in Russian. You go ahead.
Yeah, I think we can hold that thought because we're getting to that.
Sorry.
But thank you. I'm glad. Well, I'm glad that it's kind of evoking that question. All right. But if we were to kind of try and improve the sentence in terms of how it would be more acceptable to a native speaker, right, we could say something like, this reveals that the author lacks confidence in finding a solution to the problem of intelligence measurement, right? So when I'm trying to Englishize the sentence, I'm inevitably kind of thinking, okay, well, who's actually the subject, right? Who's actually doing the action? Who's actually lacking confidence? And who is actually noticing that lack of confidence? And you could also, in terms of like, if we know, right, who, you can say something like, I notice, right? I notice the author's lack of confidence, or I notice that the author lacks confidence, right? So when we're kind of trying to get rid of the negative transfer, we're getting back to the strong subject verb pair. Where's the subject? Where's the verb? What's the action that's happening in the sentence, and who's the character performing the action? And sort of, I think that's one of the biggest tips that I usually try to give my students in terms of like how to fight the transfer, right? Think strong subject verb pairs. Well, now what about Kazakh, right? Again, I will throw out this question to you guys. What are your expectations in terms of how Kazakh sentence structure might affect English writing?
Maybe because the verb is at the end of the Kazakh sentence, it can influence the structure of the English version of this sentence. This is something that comes to my mind first.
Yeah, perhaps I think that's a very reasonable assumption, one that I also kind of was thinking of before I actually looked at my sample. So let's look at this same sentence, but written by a Kazakh speaker, we can notice the author's lack of confidence about the solutions for the problem of measuring intelligence. So it's very interesting that, so I'll put the Russian sentence up there as well for comparison. So when I asked my friend Laura to write this sentence in Kazakh, she was immediately kind of like, well, who's lacking confidence? So she went to that question immediately when she was trying to write this in Kazakh. And so we can see here that this, for one, we've got a subject verb pair in we can notice, and then we also put the author in it, because that's, she was actually demanding, right? Give me who is lacking confidence, or I cannot translate this to Kazakh. I cannot say this in Kazakh without this. It won't make sense. And so that kind of brings us to a hypothesis that Kazakhs, because of the structure of the verb final structure and a more of a rigid word order structure than Russian, Kazakh-speaking writers might be less prone to passive constructions than Russian-speaking writers. And so actually from my small sample of the writing that my students allowed me to analyze, I did notice a tendency to rely on strong subject verb pairs, which actually surprised me and was against my initial assumptions. And when I also discussed this with my friend Laura, right, who's studying Kazakh writing, she actually said that when she translates to Kazakh from Russian, for example, or from English, but more from Russian, that she always feels that this need, right, to first identify the character who's doing something, right? And she was saying that in Kazakh, you almost need the subject to be a person, right? You want to find an identifiable character to be the subject in the sentence. And so this kind of might be a positive transfer from Kazakh to English, right? If Kazakh speakers are used to strong subject verb pairs in Kazakh, they might instinctively look for that or fall back on that habit when they're writing in English, which results in clearer English writing as well. But there's more. So remember this sentence from the example on prepositions, right? So this was about, this was the sentence on linguists comparing characteristics in different languages, right? So this is how this would be written in Kazakh. And so if we do a I've done here a direct translation to show word order. And so if you look at this in English, in the way it would actually be directly translated, makes zero sense, right? It's just a word jumble. And so when I was setting out, I was actually kind of thinking, well, the sentence structure order is, if it's different, right? The object always is in the middle for Kazakh, then it would actually result in more mistakes perhaps in English, right? But actually, what I then found through my research, as Karina already spoiled for us, is that linguists have identified that actually similar features between native and second language might pose more problems and cause more negative transfer. In contrast, when the second language is notably different from your native one, it can lead to more awareness and better categorization of the items and structures of the second language, which is also sometimes called in literature native language transfer benefit, right? So if a Kazakh speaker was trying to translate directly, they would notice that even if they were a beginner, that this just looks too wrong in English, right? So they would sort of be more cognizant that English works differently. So it's kind of like, so those examples that we have in terms of like when there's no prepositions, right? In Kazakh, as Karina also astutely pointed out, when there's nothing to fall back on, right, for a Kazakh speaker, because there's nothing similar in terms of language units in your native language. So instead, you're sort of more aware of how the language you're learning actually works. Whereas for Russian speakers, because there's more similarity to English in some ways, then they actually kind of might lead to more transfer, more negative transfer. And also, one of the things that I notice also a lot in student writing is this type of sentence. According to research, one of the main factors which is affecting the development of an individual's intelligence is the socioeconomic status of the family, of his family. What do you think about this sentence?
The punctuation, which is characteristic to Russian language, I guess. We've got different обороты.
Yeah, exactly. When I see this, I immediately kind of imagine the Russian sentence in my head when I'm grading my students' writing, right? Is that который влияет на развитие интеллекта человека is kind of like transferred directly into English. And if we were trying to again, like Englishize it, right, we would instead say something like, according to research, the socioeconomic status of an individual's family is one of the main factors that affects the development of his intelligence. Not an ideal sentence, but you're kind of you're following more the convention, the structural conventions of English language here, again, by thinking of, what's the subject? It's the socioeconomic status. That is one of the main factors. So we're dragging that to the front instead of this more Russian-like construction. But now when I give this sentence to when this sentence is filtered through Kazakh, right? It's interesting that it actually looks like this. According to studies, the socioeconomic status of the family is one of the main factors that affect the development of a person's intellect. So it's actually pretty much word for word with the sentence that I fixed from Russian, right? Written by a Kazakh speaker who didn't see the English version at all. So I gave only the Russian to Laura, right? And so kind of there's perhaps even more evidence, right, for native language transfer benefit, again, in terms of, because Kazakh also relies on subject verb pairs, it might lead Kazakh speakers to write more clearly in English as well. Right, so we don't have, I'm going to skip verb tense because I want to get to this part as well that Lori asked a question about, because there's a field of contrastive analysis, right, which looks at these specific features of languages. But then there's also contrastive rhetoric, and that's kind of a little bit similar, or very similar to Laura's question. It's when we're looking at cultural differences in writing, and this has been kind of pioneered by Robert Kaplan and Ulla Connor. So if you're interested in this, those are the names that you want to look up on Google, right? And so what contrastive rhetoric is looking at is a link between culturally specific logic or thought patterns and paragraph structures in English essays written by non-native English speaking students. So you're kind of looking at writing by non-native speakers, and you're trying to like, okay, where do we see their innate features of their language and culture coming through? So this might be what I think it's somewhat similar in its foundational assumptions is the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And you guys might be familiar with this from the 2016 sci-fi movie Arrival, because that, I think, popularized the hypothesis very to the wide public. And that hypothesis posits that the structure of a language affects how its speaker actually perceives and categorizes the world around them. And it has kind of two variations. There's the hard version of the hypothesis where it's saying that the structure of the language actually determines how you think, in that if you have no way of articulating a certain idea in your language, then you will not actually even perceive it in the world. So, but that kind of hard version of the hypothesis there's a consensus that there's no evidence for it. But there's like a softer version of it where it's not so deterministic, but it just says that, well, it affects your perception and cognition to some degree. And proponents of the theory feel like there is empirical evidence for it. And so it's kind of similar to contrastive rhetoric in that it's positing there are some unique kind of innate rhetorical conventions in each language. And when a non-native writer writes in English, those rhetorical conventions interfere with English writing. So for example, something you might see in literature in terms of this and kind of like in conversations around this is that English is a democratic language. It's low context, right? What Lori was getting at earlier, right? That it's kind of like more direct, more explicit, less is implied. It's not kind of like as between the lines, it's economical, it values concision, it's kind of like in your face, right? Well, what's the point type of language. Whereas for Russian, it's often said that Russian is a more hierarchical language, that it's high context, right? That it relies on a lot of cultural knowledge, that it's more verbose, and it's less direct, right? That is more nuanced, there's between the lines communication, it's more implicit rather than explicit. And now for in my kind of research, if we can call this, right, of what people think about this in terms of Kazakh language, it's kind of similar. A lot of the same things are said about Kazakh, that it's verbose, that it's not direct, that it's kind of like a lot of between the lines communication. And also things that I've noticed said about Kazakh is that it's more emotional, it's drawn to vivid imagery and use of metaphors, it's less individualistic, more collective, kind of appeals to community values a lot, and also that it's less argumentative by nature. So what do you guys think about this?
This is actually very true for me, because I also think that the English is very democratic. Like, you know, you can, I don't know, it's like on the level of consciousness, you can feel like you can freely express your thoughts in English, and you won't be given a judgmental looks. I don't know, maybe it's because the English speaking population is more liberalistic in terms of expressing opinions rather than Russian and Kazakh speaking audience. Yeah, Kazakh language is very emotional. But you know, I also was wondering about the relatively lack of is that there is a relative lack of passive voices in Kazakh language when translating to English. Why is it like this? And you know, maybe it's the consequences of the colonial past, because we lost a lot of we lost the richness of our language, and it was very simplified during the colonial past, and now it is so simple and became so straightforward in comparison to the maybe Abai era or the era of the philosophers and writers. So it's very interesting, actually.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think, I mean, I've been trying to look at, has there been any specific kind of contrastive research about Kazakh language? And there's really not a lot. So it's a pretty rich field of study. If anybody, you know, wants to delve into this, you could probably find lots of interesting things. I mean, from my own small sample, I think I found a lot of things that surprised me, and I would really, really love to get into deeper. But kind of before we wrap up, I do want to sort of point at something that's a little bit bothersome to me, and I don't really have answers. I hope that you leave this webinar with more questions than you came in, but kind of, I mean, I'm glad that you kind of were questioning, right? Is it because of the language, or is it because of how it kind of society is like, right, for English speakers. And that's kind of like the question that I've been thinking a lot about. Is it about some kind of innate language or cultural features, or is it something else? Because so far we've been talking about what in the writing field, right, we call local issues, right? So grammar and mechanics and things like that. But when we look at global issues, right, when we look at things such as argument construction, right, ability to write explicit debatable arguments, ability to write strong thesis statements and place thesis statements at the beginning of your paper. When we talk about concision and also vagueness, kind of in looking at these different issues, what would your guess be in terms of who struggles with, which group of students struggles with these more?
I guess Russian, because you know Russian is my first language and Kazakh the second and English is the third one. And you know Russian is very dominant in my head when I'm thinking, when I'm writing, when I'm speaking. And I started to notice after I started to write in English that Russian language is very vague language in terms of thesis setting, in terms of argument construction, because I was a debater when I was doing my bachelor, and it was also I can trace it back to my bachelor's when I was a debater and I was doing it in Russian language. And you know, Russian is more like art. I don't know how to explain it. It's not that constructive and straightforward as English, and that is why I guess it's Russian. And also, as a Russian speaking, I had these issues and I had these problems, and with the punctuation also. So I guess it's Russian.
Okay. Any other guesses, ideas?
If nobody's going to jump in, I would just say that in the Russian diaspora, right? So the Russian speakers who are in Canada, for example, they have the reputation for being super blunt, right? So just coming out and saying what they feel and sort of in a forceful way. So I don't know, maybe it's like certain groups of Russians, or, the Russians that live in other parts of the world are more, and when we travel, like when we were in Mexico at a resort and there were Russians there, they were super blunt. So I don't know if it's certain kinds of Russians that feel that they're more entitled. So anyway, I'm sure you're right on one sense, Karina, but then I think that maybe there's other types of Russian speakers perhaps out there too.
Yes, I think that's great because we're moving towards nuance, right? So what I want to say is that actually there's no difference, right? When I grade my students' rating in terms of these things, right, and me being familiar with both languages, I simply cannot identify if this is a Kazakh speaker or a Russian speaker in front of me based on any of these things, because both groups struggle with absolutely the same issues. I mean, yes, if they're mixing up gender pronouns, then I might have a guess. But if that's not happening, there's really so far just no indication that I've been able to find, kind of like in my years of working with students and teaching students writing. And so kind of what I want to sort of propose, we also think about in addition to innate language or innate cultural features, is keeping context in mind. Because I think what is happening is not simply language or cultural transference, but also transferring previous writing experience or lack of it. So if we look at our Russian and Kazakh speaking students, they have pretty similar backgrounds very often in terms of, right, what the high school, the writing they did in high school, right, which is usually for literature classes, right? So, and we can think about, okay, what kind of writing do we write in Russian and Kazakh literature classes? Well, it's usually about poetry, right? It's about descriptions of nature. So you are evaluated for imagery and metaphors. So perhaps that's where the verbosity is actually coming from, right? And also a lot of the, if a student has any experience of writing in English, it's usually in the context of learning English, and they are usually there for the purpose of studying certain grammatical structures, right, or studying a certain vocabulary. And so they're actually not taught things like how to construct an argument, what even constitutes an argument, a common or the how do you structure a paper, and all of the things that students are expected to do once they come into the context of Nazarbayev University, right, and the context of academic or argumentative writing. And so kind of, I think here, what I want to kind of end on, right, is for us to think on what exactly is being transferred, because I would like kind of to push toward challenging essentialism, right? I think contrastive rhetoric is very fun and fascinating, but it worries me a little when it pushes us to kind of make really big assumptions, because when we're even thinking about, okay, Kazakh speakers, well, what kind of Kazakh speakers? Kazakh speakers from the countryside, Kazakh speakers who live in the cities, Kazakh speakers from a middle class background, working class background, upper class background, Kazakhs who live in Kazakhstan or a Kazakh diaspora, right? Like Lori said, Russians who live in Kazakhstan, Russians who live in Moscow, Russians who live abroad, right? So if we kind of make this, if we search for innate features in language or culture, we're kind of risk essentializing and falling into stereotypes, right? So that's kind of what I want to say, right? That both groups of students often write in vague, verbose, and unclear ways. Both groups often struggle with writing strong arguments. And but also, judging from literature on writing, similar mistakes are made by writers across languages simply due to inexperience or lack of exposure to conventions of specific contexts and genres, right? And so, and moreover, research shows that contrastive rhetoric reportedly has sometimes led to simplistic pedagogical practices, which kind of tended to present the Anglo-American writing pattern as superior, and also could lead to potentially stigmatizing students in terms of their national identity, presenting a very static view of cultures, ethnocentrism, essentialism, right? So I think it's important to kind of, for sure, very interesting and fascinating for me as well to think about how our native language and culture might affect our writing style, but it's also important not to confuse dynamic context for innate, unchangeable features. And so you might be asking, right, well, what can we do instead? I think the thing that I feel at this moment in time, at least, is the most useful thing is building metacognition in yourself, and for us as faculty, encouraging metacognition in our student writers. What is metacognition? It means thinking about thinking, right? When you are constantly reflecting on what have I done, right? What am I doing right now? Why? Where is this coming from? And kind of questions like this in terms of your writing. So what you can do kind of as an exercise, right? Analyze your previous writing experiences. What genres have you done before? In what contexts? What conventions were in place? What expectations were put on you? What audience were you writing for? And with which purpose? And so what you can do is try to reflect how these previous experiences have influenced the writing habits that you have now developed, and then compare that to what context and for what purposes and for which audience are you writing now? How has it changed from your past? And does that change call for adjustment of your writing habits? So that wraps it up for today's webinar. Thank you so much for your attention. Have you got any questions or maybe final thoughts and comments?
Thank you for this presentation. Actually, time flies because I didn't even notice how the hour passed, and I can relate to all of the stuff that you talked about the Russian speaking non-native writers, because actually, yeah, I'm doing the same mistakes constantly, and instructors probably really don't like my writing style, because sometimes they will, oh, Karina, why are you writing this? Why this introduction is so long and is so like poetry? But you know, sometimes I feel like it's not that beautiful if it's without any passive constructions, passive voices, without any kind of adverbs and all of the stuff. I don't know. In Russian, it makes the sentence beautiful, and your speech is beautiful when you're doing this. But in English, it's probably not. So I need to like maybe leave this habit here and go ahead of this. And maybe you have some kind of advices how to improve academic writing, because I was taking some courses on the punctuation, and I'm already working on this, but about the sentence construction, about the clear thesis setting, agenda setting, about the argument construction is very difficult for me to not doing in Russian style and very poetry style. So maybe you have some kind of advice.
I would really advise you, if you are able to take our course, WCS 230, Say What You Mean, because I'm not sure what year you are in, but if you are able, I think that would actually be the perfect course for you. But I can also send you some chapters that are assigned in that class that I feel like would be really, really helpful. And they have some exercises that you can maybe work on your own if you'd like.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, thanks so much. I think there is also like the question of how can we balance, right, the style that we want to write in and our native, right, the things from our native language that want to kind of come in, because on one hand you could argue that that's what makes your writing stand out, and so I think there's also like the bigger question of, are we able to balance, right? And does clear writing mean that we have to completely let go of those things, or can we somehow marry clarity with beauty, right, that you find in passive constructions?
I think that's an excellent.
Oh, I'm sorry for interrupting.
I'll just say very quickly that I think that's an excellent point, because one of the classes that I was teaching, I had a physics student, and she wrote English in a way that was so precise and wonderful, and in a way that I've never read before. And she was bringing her own background to the writing of English. So she had physics about her, and her Kazakh was her first language, and her style of writing was so interesting because I just hadn't seen, and it was correct enough in English that it was wonderful. Like, she had this beautiful balance. Anyway, go ahead, Karina. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's very difficult to balance it, because you don't want to leave your background, your national identity, and all of the stuff. You want to bring it with you in your academic environment, because it's you, it's a part of yourself, it's part of your life, and that's okay. But at the same time, you want to converge with the dominant style, writing style, in order to all other people to understand you, because it's sometimes very difficult for native speakers to understand your Russian stylized writing, because they sometimes don't get what you are trying to say, and this is the problem.
Yeah, true.
Thank you for sharing that. Any other thoughts or questions?
I'd like to thank you for this presentation. I really enjoyed it. It was really informative and clear. To be honest, writing is a real struggle for me in any language. So when I write, I do find some challenges. For instance, as in Karina's case, it's like passive. In my cases, my sentences are always long because I compare it with Russian, and when my professors tell me like you should somehow simplify it, for me it seems like too simple, maybe not having like enough information, and so that's why I do feel like a bit confused in some cases. But anyway, thank you for this presentation, and I hope you feel better soon. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for your well wishes. Well, I think we're definitely out of time now. So once again, thank you so much for your attention and for participating. And I hope that this webinar has maybe encouraged you to be more reflective, right? And to build your own metacognition in terms of who am I as a writer.